to make some sort of position here for Contour this evening, and also close collaborators with whom other journeys have started, like Vivian, Sihar, and also I wanted to mention the Dutch Art Institute, with whom we're going to be partnering as the Contour Biennale aid, and welcome the school within the Biennale during the opening week with a public program. And yeah, I have a lot of sort of pieces to bring together to really introduce the Biennale in a meaningful way. But I wanted to just sort of express my gratitude for those who are in the room and the partnerships that we'll be carrying forward. Also at Witte de With, with Daphne and Natasha, we started to understand intuitively, and I really appreciate the fact that when there are shared values and when there is real generosity, the commonness in our projects features in the most valuable way, and not as kind of territorial understandings of who we are trying to represent. And so it's wonderful that Eric Baudelaire, Judy Redul, and Rana, who is with us, are all going to be present in some way in Witte de With, just not as an announcement, but just as something I feel it's important to share. So this is also how this becomes a common space to share practice today. In my role here now as curator of Contour, I'd like to stress that since 2017, this has been an expanding public role and experimental values for the small-scale Biennale that have been repeatedly launched through different curators, and I feel very much the again the importance and generosity of what it means to be hosted by a small-scale Biennale, and not try to compete with the bigger events that the art world offers us all the time. So bringing together practices that assemble wide-ranging cultural knowledges and processes of production, while also conflating the exhibition complex with qualities of the cinematic field, this is what it has stood for. I'm committed to learn how audiences engage with the temporality of such a biennale, where the moving image holds a crucial place and investigated thoroughly. In a structural as well as collective sense, since this edition is going to have several kinds of collectivities, and you'll see in the, this is also the launch of the artists. So we have a flyer which shares with you the fact that we have an initiative like Council, we have the Caribbean Film Collective that I'm going to also mention further on in the presentation, but also artists working in Dharamsala, Ritu Sarin and Tenzing Sonam, who run an independent film festival of their own and have been looking at the question of Tibet in all of its manifestations of violence, subjective memory, and the kind of acts of resistance building that have been continuing for decades. Yeah. Also, we have Khalifa Cesar and Louis Henderson, who are forming a partnership for the first time. So it's also exciting when artists that you've known and followed choose each other and decide to launch a moving image practice that can converge, even though they're so kind of set in their approaches. I think that, again, was something that we're privileged to experience and how it unfolds. And I've also been thinking very much how the Biennale organism performs a certain kind of social mandate, how its ethical life remains alive to the concerns of our times, and through artistic acts that remain unafraid to implement a propositional approach within the exhibition body, such that there is a polyphony of act making. And I hope these characteristics become clearer within the presentation and the artist dialogue that we're going to have today. Within this idea of polyphony, it also became quite important for me to have advisors alongside. And so, yeah, here you see also that we have Judy Redul, one of the artists within the exhibition, and Denise Ferrer de Silva, who have been advisors to me, importantly so in their way of thinking and their own endurance with which they constantly labor around the thinking, and the sort of collaborations that have been built. So there's this wonderful book that Judy co-edited that thinks around questions of law, media, and aesthetics that became sort of Bible for me in building this exhibition. But also Denise's work on questions of race and Black poetics, just things that are absolutely crucial to bring to Mechelen in the times that we are in today. When thinking about the more grounded history of Mechelen, not a place that I was very familiar with, but that I've learned a lot from, Mechelen was actually a historical, legal stronghold for medieval Europe for many centuries, and the curatorial approach engages with the 400-year-old juridical past of the Great Council and the Court of Savoy, from where the law was not only spoken but enacted as a regional force across Dutch, German, and French territories. From the vestiges of Europe's first court, then, what might it mean to survey the field of social justice and its implements as media archaeology, such that justice itself is considered a medium, a process, simultaneously that is performative, ethical, and aesthetic? This is a painting that inspired me greatly and that I've shared also with Remco and the artists, and I feel like we've gained a lot from this image of this painting as a civic site, and carrying the architecture of the city council, in which even today it is within the municipal building, so that the monthly meetings of the governing council are held there. And this enabled me to also think so much around the court as a performative site, but one that is so embedded in codes and hierarchies in which there's actually very little freedom to reposition oneself. And so what does it mean for artists to be the forces that radically reposition all the time themselves and the audience? Another gift that came from Mechelen was also research into polyphony and this quite fascinating world of what polyphony truly implicated, which is not simply a multiplicity of voices and orders in which the voice makes its appearance, but actually a very important kind of public site in itself, one that is representational. And in fact, one of our venues, which used to be the palace of Margaret of Austria, is where she sat, and you had the scribe who was making the illuminated manuscripts, who was composing, and that scribe was in fact also an important figure within governance processes. The scribe as a kind of detective, if you want, or the scribe as an ambassador. And there were these double agents, one of them being someone called Palmyra. I'm always asking when we go and visit the researchers of the polyphonic music, what do they know? I want all of the dark gossip about who these people really were and what they did in terms of the role of administration, where music turns into figures of governance. We're still finding that out. This is also an occasion to share with you some of the venues that we will be hosting the show within, and it's through the generosity of the city, really, and the way that Contour is actually welcomed within the city. It is not at all a biennale that is feared or one that is opposed by the local community. It is one which is very warmly welcomed, and this in itself is something that one feels very lucky about as a curator, because often you see that it's not the case. So one of our major sites is the Schepenhuis, which is the former house of the aldermen and one of the oldest buildings in Flemish history that has been preserved mostly in its original form and architectural detail. Apart from the time when it was, it suffered a fire and was destructed within the time of the World War. But it has previously been the seat where the Great Council sat. And so it is a place that has witnessed these meetings of this legal body that we are referring to. And it also, for me, kind of brings in what kind of challenges and propositions we can make within the architecture of this building and other legal architectures that are floating within this city and that have had other kinds of lives. So this has been a city archive. It's going to be, unfortunately, but a tourist office in the future. But before that, we actually get to use it, which is really special. Another little thing I wanted to mention is that after working with 4 other curators of slightly larger biennales, this kind of routine that happens with artists' visits was something that I kept wanting to reshuffle and understand, like meaningfully, what can one do when an artist visit takes place for a biennale in a city that is not so known. It doesn't matter if it's as close as Belgium or as far as, I don't know, Sao Paulo. The feeling is the same of not knowing and of you putting in your very precious and important work in that place. And so we did try, as far as possible, we did group visits. And so this became a way in which the artists could exchange and meet each other and share their own kind of understanding of the city. But we also had these processes that you see here of visiting sites that were not only linked to the show itself, but were important within the cartography of the city. We also looked a whole lot at different kinds of polyphonic manuscripts and various other historical documents as requested for different projects and artists. It was also important for me to not be trapped within the historic center of this medieval history and valorize it. But for long, and initially even early on with Denise, we tried to look for a site that did represent the actual community, and that is there's this site called the Mahatma Gandhi district where over 3,000 families are living from several, I think, 30 or 40 different countries. And we visited to see if this could be a place for us to work in. So this was also, in a sense, trying to assess how to make ourselves relevant for communities that are living here and not the highly privileged citizens of the center, very small center. One of the things that has happened as a result of this is that we will be present within, right next to the Regional Open Youth Center called ROIM, where there's this huge co-working center which has a welfare purpose from the city. And this youth center for me was really capturing the spirit of the city in a way that is absolutely necessary. The young people who come from difficult backgrounds and have lived through their parents, kind of gotten to know what it means to not be an outsider, not to be a new resident, and all of these terms and labels that are applied very cautiously, tolerantly, sometimes very violently at communities who live here. I'm going to quickly run through a few practices, also artists who aren't with us and importantly frame the project So Judy Radul is one of them, and her World Rehearsal Court was one of these concrete projects that had happened and became a solid reference point. And here she talks about various aspects of representation within the court, the way that the court turns into a site that is pretty much like a television studio, in the way that there are so many technologies, so many visual technologies that are within the court, whether it's from the video circuit cameras to the way that the microphones operate, to the glass shields that separate different inhabitants of the court site. And she also led me to understand how the courtroom works much as a theater. Again, I think for Rana that has been quite important as well in different ways. The theatricality of the process of testimony building and of the rituals of presenting oneself in front of the law. In the Belgian context, there's Koba Matthijs of Agency, who some of you may know in this room, who's been affected a bit as part of an event. And he's been working for over 20 years on questions of legal and extra-legal structures through what he calls a list of things. And these things then invite you to rethink authorship, intellectual property, originality, that create the needed dissonance and recategorize aspects of nature and culture and tradition in modernized societies, the place of folklore, for instance, in building a case for an indigenous minority rather than a state appropriating body. So Koba will think about extra-human and other than human, non-human protagonists and their role in terms of claiming authorship, to put it short. There's also another important existing work that I wanted to mention, which is by Anna Torfs, who's again an artist based in Brussels. And this is a phenomenal project of hers called Anatomy, in which she basically takes up this scrutinizing gaze into the case of the murder of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and read through the entire document of 1,200 pages to consider how actors could revisit this trial and build a new sort of oral memory for what the events of this trial were and their implications for us today as well. And the figures here you see are staged in an anatomical theater in Berlin, so the literal kind of space of the dissection chamber. Nearly finished. This is from a trip I was fortunate to make to the Caribbean Film Collective in Bellman community with Rachel O'Reilly. And Vivian and I have worked with Caribbean for quite a while now, and continue to in different ways. And it's through Elizabeth Palminelli that we started to understand what the kind of absolutely radical and crazy ideas are at stake here in actually producing film. What are the kind of conditions to think through the reality of sovereign governance and liberal settler colonialism that sort of continues, and the way that this practice has constantly had to create new kinds of status of, say, what Beth calls improvisational realism, to perform their daily lives in a way that is then cast into filmic narratives. They have a trilogy at this point, which is called the Intervention Trilogy. And here you see members of the group watching their latest film, Wutar, which Vivian has actually written about recently and was screened on Vitrom. And here, what's important is that the collective is intergenerational, so the youngest members are, actually there's an 8-year-old who also sometimes drops into the films, And the entire logic of acting, of finding locations, of sound recording is quite fascinating to watch and learn from. And you never know when someone from the police force is going to drop by while the film is still being shot. And so there's a real risk in continuing such a practice of filmmaking. And I believe it's the first time that such a practice would be included in Contour. Lastly, this is a screenshot from a film by Basir Mahmood from Lahore, who's now at the Rights Academy. And Monument of Arrival and Return is one of our first completed works for the Biennale. And again, the question of labor cannot be separated from justice, clearly. So for me, it was great when Basir decided that his protagonists, often who are not actors, daily laborers, and the precarity of the daily laborer who has to kind of almost reinvent himself or herself on an everyday level in order to be part of the informal hiring economy. Basir was working with coolies, who we've inherited through the British when they introduced trains. They introduced coolies, the coolies who carry baggage and who take us from one place to another, from the train to the platform to the city. And here there's a kind of poetic investigation of the role of the coolie and through it, I think, very important question of labor. Okay. Now, done. I just have to show you one thing. How do I get to the website? Remco to the rescue, which is generally the case. So following me will be Remco, our wonderful designer, who most of you know. Before that, I'm going to advertise that we have a really great online journal. And every month we have a couplet or pairings of essays, soon poetry, video essays as well, so it's reading and viewing in different styles, interviews by participating artists, filmmakers, poets, anthropologists, thinkers of different kinds. And we also have an online project, which is the Inhabitants channel. And Inhabitants is Pedro Nunes Marquez and Mariana Silva, who often collaborate with other artists, with activists. They also do archival research in extensive scales, or they have been attending events such as the Anthropocene campus and the Technosphere at the Hakaway, and thinking through how to make visible those forms of live research processes. And in a sense, thinking very much in relation to how new genres of journalism can be explored within such a practice and circulate across different environments, so contemporary culture, as well as what might be seen as news sources, in a sense. And yet, maintaining a critique of the click-based, the comment-based, the VR technology that swoops in and creates, tries to bring you into a horizon of simulation that is often a corrupted viewing of reality. And so their first actual episode for Contour, because we've also been hosting an earlier episode by Philippa and Louis, is the one I'm going to show you now. And it's called Hobby Lobby versus the Allegory of Justice. I'm going to read through a few lines of their introduction. Inhabitants' new episode within the context of Contour weighs the fiction of allegorical images against the concept of the legal fictitious person. In particular, it puts in perspective the abstract body of justice in relation to the status attributed to corporations for juridical purpose under the US law. Set to the tone of feminist post-punk bands and composers, we draw on a recent US Supreme Court legal case that granted religious rights to a corporation called Hobby Lobby, which allowed it to deny its federal obligation to provide contraceptive healthcare to its female employees. The case sets jurisprudent record, which means the consequences of this ruling may come to affect women's autonomy and rights to their bodies in the future. I'm now happy to welcome Remco van Vladel, who's our designer, but has also worked extensively with organizations like Witte de With Council, has done the super community project for eFlux, and several other important artist books for which he's also won awards. Welcome, Remco.
Thank you, Natasha. Yes. Okay. And Natasha asked me today to kind of briefly go in and introduce a little bit about the identity kind of development for Contour 8. Which is it's quite fascinating. It's not often that it happens. Usually, people only look at flyers and stuff surrounding biennales, but they never ask questions. So here I go. I've kind of made a couple of kind of simple slides. Won't take much of your time before we go into the introduction and the artist talks, but it gives you kind of some kind of background in the way kind of we communicate, how we discuss ideas surrounding this kind of biennale that wasn't kind of course, the identity is being made while we are also working on it. So we already saw this image before in the presentation by Natasha, and when she came to me to ask if I was willing to work with her on this project, I was very happy, of course. It was a big challenge, and it became an even bigger challenge when she kind of laid out the topics and the ideas surrounding this biennial. That okay, Remco, on the one hand, I would love to try to kind of dive into the kind of legal issues and the history of the legal Great Council of Mechelen, and also work on polyphony. And those kind of two worlds were kind of for a somewhat limited graphic designer were kind of almost like incomprehensible. There was this great juxtaposition, like, okay, how do I need to kind of deal with these two completely different kind of points of entry? So looking into that, and also I have some kind of background in music and my fascination towards notation systems and graphic scores. I was kind of looking into this polyphony, and one of the first things that when we were looking also into the research surrounding the Great Council is that, of course, that we stumbled upon this image. And what I liked so much about it is that it had this kind of performative aspect of all the structures and the positioning of people in there. And I think one of the most elementary things that I found was what I was kind of intrigued by was that it was one of the first paintings that I know that were almost like an infographic, that they have all these layers of typography in them. And then on the other hand, there was this floor that kind of was mesmerizing me. So it was kind of almost like a top level where you would have this kind of with X and Y grids on which all the figures were kind of floating on and surfacing, and all these kind of voices would kind of float on top of this floor. So that was kind of one of the starts, to kind of work on this kind of performative space, and then use a kind of a multiplicity of voices to kind of create a polyphony. And so one of the first references that I had is that I looked into different types of polyphony, and I stumbled upon this fugue, the fuga, which is a slightly later one. It's not specifically a Flemish polyphony, but it intrigued me in the way that it's how it was kind of described in being this kind of imitative aspect and a canon kind of repeating itself, but then having different structures kind of floating towards making a new structure, which for me, going into a more kind of formal aspect, that brings it to a kind of moire for me. So that was kind of the second part. So I kind of tried to think about having the fugue and this performative floor as being kind of a moire of voices, which turned into my 8. So here it's kind of finding images, sharing conversations with Natasha and the rest of the team, trying things out, and then seeing kind of where it leads into. And then this other image that I wanted to kind of bring was some of the old kind of more kind of army kind of shields of the city of Mechelen, where these kind of etching techniques, but also the 3 red kind of banners that are a part of the shield of Mechelen, became kind of a template, like a backdrop of everything. Which kind of all combined turned into this kind of template of having, yeah, almost a notational kind of field where these 3 lines, those 3 kind of voices, would kind of be an anchor point for whatever kind of graphic means, and trying to kind of, it's probably kind of a very typographic thing, but then finding kind of a system where we could kind of counterbalance something that is very much related to a kind of a very old serif, which is the centaur. I never used it. I finally had the chance to use it, and the Memphis, which is a slab serif, which kind of relates more to the floor of the 8. So when we started to kind of going into kind of other details, is that of course that the website was one of the first things that we kind of developed, and we are kind of in the midst, and we're still kind of 5 months ahead, and every time there's kind of these new questions popping up, and we're kind of trying to kind of reevaluate and think what we can do, and how those kind of shapes, how they could kind of play and kind of reinvent themselves and make new patterns and new moires every time there's some kind of movement that surrounds it. So by scrolling infinitely, you get these kind of new combinations inside the 2 shapes, kind of making this moire, which is at the heart. So every time, everywhere, it always starts to rotate and starts to kind of create new shapes. But that's a website, so please check it out if you have the time. I want to kind of conclude to this, just kind of briefly give you kind of some kind of core elements of what we've been discussing, and to kind of close off. We kind of made this kind of small introduction movie for the introduction of the artists.
I'm not going to do very elaborate introductions because I'm aware we're also spent a lot of time already, but the most important part is now to introduce 3 artists who we have with us today, who are going to make reflective presentations on their current work, what they're thinking through, and how we're discussing together for Contour. So there are going to be a few questions that I field to them as a group, but we'll also open up, and we're going to start with Eric Baudelaire.
Natasha for inviting me tonight, but also for inviting me to participate in the biennial. I think we first met. I met Natasha in Taipei in 2012, where I was pretending to be a curator. It's the first time I curated. And we both had a small part of the biennial that Hans and Frankie had given us to organize a little sort of mini museum inside of the broader show, and so we met as curators. And I've given up since then. It's far too difficult a job. I guess 1 year ago, around this time of the year, maybe a week later than now, a year ago, I was in Korea working on a project on a film I'm planning to shoot over there. And then on November 13th, obviously, I wasn't in France, and this is when the massacre happened at the Bataclan and at the Stade de France, and so I came back from Korea back to France, and I sort of put the Korean project on hold for some time. It's continuing, it's ongoing. I was there again last week, but I sort of postponed it because I felt a very strong sense of urgency to do something related to not just what had happened in November last year in Paris, because it's not the first time it's happened and it's not the last time it will happen. It's sort of an ongoing series of violent explosions of some kind of very deep malaise, to say things very, perhaps a little bit too simply. But I felt a need to do a work, to start a process, film that would be somehow related to this ongoing situation. And so, and I had a very strong sense of urgency of doing this project now, of putting everything else on hold. So I postponed a number of shows. I postponed this film, and I just wrote very quickly, I think it might have been November 15th or 3 or 4 days later, a 2-page statement of urgency of this is a film I want to do. It's called AKA Jihadi, and I sent it out to a handful of people who I have worked with, who I have been in conversation with, telling them, that this is something that I urgently wanted to produce, that I was going to devote the next year to it, and if anybody was interested in helping me, make it possible, then it would be wonderful. And Natasha was one of the very first people who responded and was one of the first people on board to help me make the film. The principle for the film is very simple. It's based on I've had an ongoing practice of sort of a dialogue that's gone on for several years with a Japanese filmmaker called Masao Adachi. I made a film about him, I made a film with him, and in general I've been sort of dialoguing with this practice for 5 or 6 years now. He made a film in 1969 called AKA Serial Killer. He and 6 other Japanese filmmakers and critics got together. In 1969, a young man stole a gun from an American army base in Yokohama, and he went and killed 4 people over a course of 3 days, sort of a shooting spree that was never really explained. He was 19 years old. He never explained the reason for the killings. But this was 1969, and there was a very strong sort of feeling of political reinvention in Japan at the time, both in the arts and in the political sphere. And I think Adachi and his colleagues' instinct was that there was something necessarily political about this gesture, and they wanted to make a film about it. There was no information because this young man wasn't speaking. He was detained but wasn't really explaining anything. And so they went on a sort of journey towards different parts of Japan where this young man had lived. So they started in Hokkaido, where he was born, and they sort of circulated around the archipelago, filming landscapes of places where this young man had lived. At first, the idea was that this was just location scouting for a film that they would eventually produce. And then as they continued to location scout, they eventually sort of thought, maybe actually this is the film. You know, and you have to imagine that in the 1960s, sort of a political or socially oriented documentary would normally have turned the camera towards the subject. I mean, we imagine, you know, the films of various political documentaries that were being done at the same time in Japan against the building of Narita Airport, for example, filming the worker in struggle, filming the student in struggle. The camera was always turned towards the subject of the struggle. And in this instance, I think what was kind of revolutionary about the gesture is that they decided to turn the camera 180 degrees away from the subject to the things that the subject has seen throughout their life. And so they gave this a name. They called it Fukeiron, which was sort of the landscape theory in Japanese. Fukei is landscape, or Fukeiron means landscape theory. And it's a film that is a kind of a manifesto. You can watch it. It's on YouTube. It's called AKA Serial Killer. It's 70 minutes. So it's just a series of landscapes with a very small voiceover that sort of explains some basic aspects of this young man's sort of journey to prison. And obviously the landscape theory has been an important thing for me in my filmmaking, because not something that I adopted, because I actually have some fairly sizable problems with this theory as a filmmaking device, but I find it a very interesting foil to use, critique, implement, how do you say, détourner, sorry? Turn around, sort of turn on its head. Yeah, thank you. And but so it's always sort of appeared in one form or another in previous films, like The Anabasis of May and Fusako Shigenobu Masawa Adachi and 27 Years Without Images, which was my first feature film, was already sort of playing around with this landscape theory, and other films have always sort of used it in one way or another, but never fully. And in fact, I don't think any filmmaker has ever really made a landscape theory film. You could even argue that the 1969 film that Adachi and his colleagues made isn't a truly implemented serious landscape theory film, because very quickly their film turns into a sort of poetic, you know, they end up filming flowers and people riding bicycles, and there's a free jazz soundtrack that's absolutely beautiful, but it's more psychedelic in a way than it is a strictly sort of, you know, sociological examination of the landscape to decipher the political structures that may help, you know, give us some form of understanding of this series of murders. And so, you know, in Korea last year, I remember, you know, reading the news obsessively and thinking, because this, of all the various, you know, terrorist events that have happened in the past few years, I lived in New York in September 2001, and I watched the towers fall from the rooftop of my building, but I don't know anybody who died, for example, even though, and not only did I not know anybody who died in September 11th, but I don't know anybody who knows anybody who died. Even though I've been living in New York for 8 years, I don't hang out with bankers or with police officers or with firemen, and so, or with janitors, and those are really the 4 groups of people who died that day. And so it was both very close, but also very distant. And in, you know, I was in London on July 7th, 2007. I was in the subway, but I don't know anybody who died that day. And there was something that struck a lot closer to home. And this doesn't necessarily matter, because even though these events have always served as sort of the backdrop of a lot of work that I've produced in the past 15 years, it's not about personal experience, but there was something a little bit more personal this time around. And so I wanted to make a film about that would in some way, you know, allow me to go on a journey of one of the 987 French men and French women who have left France and who have gone to search for something different, something else, and who have gone to Syria and joined the ranks of Daesh. Because 960 people is a big number. And so I remember reading in the newspaper a citation by the French Prime Minister, Emmanuel Valls, who's a monumental asshole, and who said, he said that the quote was, I think he said this a week or two later, he said, I'll try to translate it, but they said that understanding is a little bit like forgiving. In other words, we should not try to understand. That we shouldn't try to put ourselves in a position of understanding why anybody would do something like this. I guess is what he's saying. And then I remember reading a book that Alain Badiou wrote very quickly, a few weeks after the events. And it was a conference he gave, and then he transcribed it into a book where he said that failing to understand, is giving a victory to the barbarity of those actions. And so I see sort of on the one hand, I guess a right-wing opinion voiced by a socialist prime minister that says that we cannot, trying to understand is like accepting and forgiving. And Badiou who said that not understanding is not an option either. And I sort of remember thinking that maybe there was some, which I don't completely agree with either, because I actually think it's possible that there is something about this thing, to name it in a very broad sense, that lies beyond the possibility of understanding, and yet we should be involved in trying to. And so this is the film I wanted to make. So I adopted the landscape theory in a very sort of stupid and first-degree manner. I chose a character, give him a name. His name is not Nabil, but he's called Nabil in the film, and he's a young man who was born in France in a family of Algerian descent, and who in 2012 went to Turkey, and then from Turkey he went to Syria, and he joined the Al-Nusra Front, which was an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and then eventually he migrated towards the Islamic State when it was founded, and returned to returned to Turkey in 2013, and then was arrested and was deported back to France, where he wasn't arrested because the Turkish police forgot to inform the French police that they were putting him on an airplane. So when he arrived in France, there was sort of a moment where nobody really knew what was going on, and he made a run for it. He left. He went south. He tried to make it to. He was found on a ferry boat in Algeria, in Spain, trying to board a ship to go to Algiers. And so he was arrested there. He was extradited back to France, and he was then detained. And his trial date was set for November 25th, 2015. And so you can imagine that facing the French justice system 10 days after November 13th is not a great timing. And so he was condemned to a 10-year prison sentence. But he's not somebody who it was proven in any way, shape, or form for having. There's no sort of material evidence that he committed any acts of violence. He's never appeared in a video beheading anybody. He's never appeared. He says that he was just sort of driving around, bringing food supplies back and forth to the border, and eventually helping some friends of his from the Paris banlieue to come and spend a couple weeks, I guess sort of what we could call jihad and tourism. And some of his friends did come. They spent a couple weeks. Some of them spent a month, but nobody really ever enrolled or enlisted or stayed there. So he's sort of this example of somebody who's a very open profile. Either somebody who sought something that he didn't really find and then eventually made his way back. But you can also look at his profile and think that he's somebody who perhaps was planning to do more, but he got caught before he did. So it's a very sort of open-ended journey. And so the film has been, I'm cutting it. I'm in the middle of cutting the film. It'll be, I guess, about 80 or 90 minutes long. It'll be shown first here at the Witte de With as part of an exhibition we'll be doing here at the end of January. And then the second time it will be shown will be with Contour. I guess it sort of tries to do all these things that I've been talking about in one way or another. But it's a very open-ended film. And the last thing I'll say is that it's also based on a trove of judicial documents that I came across of the judicial file of all of the investigation into this young man and his friends who went to Syria. So it's 6,000 pages of documents that appeared one day in my mailbox and that include the wiretaps of his phone conversations while he was in Syria, the discussions, the Skype conversations he had with his wife, the interrogation of his friends when they returned from Syria, the depositions that their family gave, a judicial what's it called, investigation of great proportion, which you can lose yourself into, and which has become part of the film as well. So the film is sort of alternates between these landscapes of the places he lived in and this other landscape, which is the state's investigation in the form of documents. Do I have time to show a small piece, or is it okay? I don't want to go on for too long, but I'll show you a small piece. It's not subtitled yet. How many of you don't speak French? Most of you don't. Okay. Maybe I'll sub it. So this is quote. I'm accused in wiretaps with my colleague Bleep and Bleep. The names will all be changed, but I haven't had time to do that yet. And he says, I like to swagger, like I told the judge, and give myself a style of somebody who's tough and knows people from the Nusra Front and other movements, Islamic movements. At first, I was just trying to help. Then, because I was a good driver, I helped people between the borders of Turkey and Syria. I never recruited people from France to come to Syria, but I did help so-and-so and so-and-so. I went to Egypt for 15 days to a month to learn to study Arabic. So-and-so came to meet me there. He's a friend from the neighborhood. And after that, I went to Syria, not too long, 5 or 6 months. With a few back and forths between Turkey and Syria. tribunal. It's a psychiatric evaluation. Essentially says after having studied the case of Mr. So-and-so, currently incarcerated in Nanterre. And there's a sort of very procedural language. I mean, it's written by a psychologist, but it's a language of the court. So, I'll just read this and then that'll be the end of the excerpt. But a presentation of the subject. And the language is very interesting because it's literally presentation of the subject. It's about a 25-year-old subject of Algerian origin and French nationality, medium height, physically strong and athletic, dark skin. He has a sort of a well-furnished head of hair and a large beard in the tradition of the Prophet. However, his clothing is well kept and clean. He has an attitude which is somewhat rigid and tense, though he participates actively and cooperates sufficiently with the interview through a verbal expression that is mostly correct. And sort of we go through these documents, various perspectives, from police interrogations to the wiretaps. And just so the last bit I just wanted to show you was this, because when we did the site visits in Mechelen, among the various venues, we visited this one, which immediately struck me because it used to be the throne room, but currently it has been converted into the courthouse, and this space here is currently used sort of as a waiting room for lawyers and magistrates and witnesses when they're waiting their turn or in between sessions or while the court is adjourning, they can come and spend some time here. And so, for example, right when we visited, there was this fellow here who looks like to me like a lawyer, I guess. And so we're going to install the film here with a sort of hopefully we'll be able to do sort of a spatialized sound inside the venue, and we won't hopefully move too much. In other words, we keep the tables and chairs and sort of keep the space as it is, make it a little darker, and show the film in the context adjacent to a courtroom. And so that's the plan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. I also learn a lot each time we talk about the film, and it's great that there are so many people on board also following this process with you. But, the way that you've taken personal risks to shoot this film, and it'll become clear where the locations are once it's complete, and something quite commendable. Now I'm happy to introduce Lawrence Abou-Hamdan, who again, just as since Eric mentioned, is an artist I've been working with for quite some time, who was present in that 2012 Witte de With Center, and a practice that I keep learning from, in relation to also how he is maneuvering within art, but then also having this sort of background in music and constantly thinking about what is happening in courts and their procedures and what it means to present evidence as an artist. That is something that can actually change the direction of a trial in different cases. And yeah, it'd be great to see what you're going to talk about now.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and it's very nice to be here and invited for Contour with a great selection of artists. So the thing is that I was going to, in the last minute, talk about what I'm going to work on for Contour, but I left the hard drive in the safe in my hotel in Mechelen, which was yesterday. So after this nice introduction, you can have another opinion of me. Anyway, so I'm going to talk more about actually sort of something that is more of a kind of approach, a way of thinking that more or less guides the production of all my works. So actually, in the end, even though what I'm talking about today and what I'm presenting in Mechelen look and may seem very different, they actually come from the same place. And that is what I want to try and define is very quickly my kind of politics of listening. And how that's really distinct from, and in a lot of my works, trying to be antagonistic towards and a kind of battle against a kind of rhetoric of free speech and of a series of kind of liberal values that have to do with speech representation. I think that's the kind of the enemy of my work. So the work I'm presenting in Contour will be along a line of research about an old and esoteric Islamic jurisprudence called taqiyya, which is most inaccurately but most easily summarized as the right to lie. So that's going to manifest itself in a very different way. But today I wanted to kind of explain why I don't think free speech and the right to privacy makes sense. So here is a story that is not a work. I'm just kind of telling a story now. So the story is that when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, he was shot, of course, by a policeman. We all know who he was shot by. But it all came down to a piece of evidence that was captured when a guy in a neighboring room was sending he was kind of sexting, actually, to somebody, and actually caught on the voice message the gunshots that killed Michael Brown. So this is the text.
You are pretty. You're so fine. Just going over some of your videos. How could I forget?
So it's this kind of very horrible recording because, of course, you hear the event in the background, and the voice in the foreground is, of course, expressing this kind of desire, and very different desire to the one that's going on in the background. So this was presented as evidence, and the whole time the courtroom were asked to ignore the voice in the foreground, right? The voice in the foreground was treated as like a sort of noise, and actually it was the gunshots in the background. So I will say a little later why actually the voice in the foreground is one of the most important things. But what I want to say for now is that this evidence then transpired. There was a guy called Robert Snowen who is a audio kind of guy, and I should say I kind of model myself on people like this Robert Snowen, who is and more recently why I'm kind of calling the practice I do not so much art, but that of a kind of private ear, like a private eye for sound. Anyway, so Robert Snowen is one of these similar characters, and he managed to take each of those gunshots and show that the echo of the gunshot actually is exactly the same, which meant that it disproved the theory that Michael Brown's killer kind of advanced towards him, right? With the gun, he moved, because if he'd moved, the echo would have changed as it kind of progressed through the space. So there was all this testimony to say that the police officer was running towards him and was firing the gun. And that disproved that theory and showed that, of course, in the perfect eyes of the law, that Michael Brown was in fact charging towards the police officer, and therefore was justified in shooting him, I think, 12 times, 3 times in the torso and a couple in the head, and also when he landed on the ground a few more times. And this was an unarmed man, by the way, of course, as we know. So, when this all came out, why Robert Snowen was called as to give testimony was because he had invented something called ShotSpotter. And ShotSpotter is something that is put all over 80 troubled neighborhoods in the US. And it's basically a series of microphones that are placed all over the city, which listen out for gunshots And then when a gun is fired, the microphones triangulate the position of the gunfire and says exactly where this shot took place, right? So he invented that thing. It's an amazing technology, and then of course it was used in this way to do this other kind of evidence. Now, the reason why this thing was invented is because no longer do anybody call in gunshots. So we hear on that recording from the guy who's sending the voice message that basically there's a kind of minimal reaction to gunshot that's going on in the distance. It's not that he didn't hear those sounds, those are very present sounds, but he chose not to listen to them. And more importantly, according to the police, which they never really addressed, is that he would never choose to call them in. Why? Because of course it's a police officer shooting the guy, and the police often can be much more kind of crazy and violent and trigger happy than the people who were firing, right? So there's a kind of lack of communication. No one wants to call the police, no one wants to call the things in, so they instead put this kind of technology over the top that serves the purpose of a kind of more faithful witness that can tell them exactly where and when these shots happen. Now, what I wanted to say is that when this came out, this technology came out in The Guardian and many other places, the reaction against it, the kind of liberal reaction is, this is a infringement against my right to privacy. These microphones might be recording what I say, and therefore this is a Fourth Amendment violation, and I don't agree with it, right? But nobody ever thought that they really don't give a fuck what you say. That's the truth of it. That they put this thing in place because they're avoiding the whole narrative of people speaking. They don't want anybody's speech. And much like the thing on the recording, we're asked to listen past that voice, not listen to it. So nobody really thought that for a second that it's really the most maybe horrible thing about surveillance is that maybe they don't care about what we're saying, rather than to be so precious about speech all the time, to be so precious about privacy. So I think that those modes of resistance are kind of have run their course. I don't think they really do anything, this kind of context of privacy and free speech. And so I would propose a very different use of this software. I would not fight against it and deny it. I would actually celebrate it. And I would try to think of ways in which we can turn it back to our own ends. And of course, now we know that this thing exists. We know that every police gunshot is being recorded. And for sure, we can tell when and where all these police shots happen. So in a way, it's an incredible resource, an incredible archive to map police violence that has yet to be used and as a resource. So that's what I wanted to say there. Now, the kind of listening back approach is embodied in this project, which is a work I did called the Hummingbird Clock. The back end of the design is by Andre Castro, who's here. So basically, this is a kind of counter-surveillance project, if you like, which uses an existing piece of surveillance in the United Kingdom and sort of repurposes it, just reuses it, which is that they are recording 24/7 the buzzing of the mains in the UK. And that buzz, the buzz that's given off from lights and electricity and comes into interference and ends up in the mics like this and into cameras like that, can be actually used as a kind of timestamp, because the electricity buzzes at a kind of unpredictable rate. It's kind of always random. And it means that any given kind of 10 seconds, or as long a sample as you can have, would be unique, right? Does that make sense? Probably not. Like, that, because it's not noise, it's actually kind of singing, right? And if you can understand it singing, if you can hear it, it's singing, you can actually use it to map events in time. That's because the national grid means that the same buzz that's in Glasgow from a fridge is the same thing from a neon light in Cardiff at exactly the same moment. So there's a kind of centralization of time in a new way and this is a website where you can go and submit a claim and send me a recording, and I will analyze it. And it tells you a little bit about the project. So, I mean, for example, if you need an alibi, the electricity can be your alibi, right? If you know you were in a certain place and it was recorded, and you know you've been accused of being somewhere else at that time, then you can use this as your alibi. Also, you can use it to show that a recording of yourself has been cut up or edited, because it will show, if it has been edited, that it's sliced up patchwork of different buzzers behind the voice. So this is this kind of approach that I've been thinking about recently, how to sort of implement and employ these things. But also, yeah, I think more recently I've started to feel that it's not only enough to present these kind of technologies and to present a kind of truth back. I think more and more what we're seeing is that we have to also lie back. So I think it's no longer kind of speaking truth to power, but actually lying back. That is the most important thing we can do. And so more recently I've become obsessed with this idea of the right to lie. And should I stop? And should I stop? That's a question. Show the tape? Okay. I wasn't going to show the tape. But yeah, I'll just leave this image here. This somehow embodies that concept. Thank you.
This is like a code.
Yes, exactly.
This is a code for what will unfold in some fashion.
At Contour.
Thank you. I'm now going to introduce our last artist speaker for this evening, and then we will go into a few questions, and we'd really love to hear from you in the audience. So please don't go away, hold on. Rana Hamadeh, as you know, is a resident of Rotterdam when she isn't traveling for her wonderful projects in different places. Her film, for instance, the Sleepwalkers, has traveled extensively in the showroom, and also at IMA, in Brisbane and other places. And the making of her projects, I think, is something to remark on and that we can come back to, which is an ongoing research process, but also a way of considering performance, objects, the building up of archival images, and setting them into critical scenographies that continue to challenge, again, the sort of basis in which justice can be staged. And I'm going to stop there, and we're also going to talk a little bit about her sound play, and now she's going to address her opera.
Hi. Thank you again, Natasha, for inviting me here and to Contour, and thank you in advance for bearing what I'm going to say. I will start with the fact that what I'm going to be doing with Contour will be the very first iteration within a very big project. We are calling it the Mammoth Project that I'm going to be working on with Witte de With, and which will be like a sort of a 2-year-long endeavor. And it is an opera. Not only the fact that it is ending up as an opera, but the fact that it is in its process and the ways with which it is going to be worked on and produced. Alongside Witte de With, and not only as a project at Witte de With, but in collaboration with Witte de With. So it is somehow, I see it as a huge endeavor, but not only only the collaboration between an artist and an institution, but also including all the labor that's going to be involved in the project from other people, including a study group that is going to be part of the project. I will start with, I mean, if I'm going to talk about the project, it's a zillion years of explaining, because it is the last, let's say, chapter under my long-standing project called Alien Encounters, which I initiated in 2011, and which at that time started with the incentive to think of the term alien and alienness, where alien is on one side understood as an outcast with regard to the law. Still, I'm saying at that time because it developed throughout the project, and on the other side as an extraplanetary figure. So throughout the project, throughout the different works, writings, discussions, and conversations within Alien Encounters, the figure of the alien turned into becoming a discursive tool to think through both corporate and state-sponsored forms of violence and the legal apparatuses that enable them. The work that, or one of the works that, because Alien Encounters is like, the works are like a soap opera, so one work comes after the other and discusses or unpacks, I don't like this word, but the kind of claims that were thrown into the world in the previous project. And in the past 2 years or more, actually, I've been working, my works sprouted from a claim that views justice as the measure to which one can access the dramatic means of representation, the degree to which one can access theater. And theater is, neither justice is what we attach to that term, nor theater is representative of what we attach to that term. So in a way, justice, and by the way, this book, which Judy invited me to contribute to in 2012, that was right. This claim regarding justice and theater actually is appropriated from one of the texts in this book, which doesn't actually make this claim, but in an oblique way opens up this question. Theater doesn't come in my work out of the blue, but rather from a long, let's say, a lexicon that I've been working with and through since 2011, which includes terms such as plague, contagion, hygiene, immunity, bloodletting, resistance, exodus, free fall, and theater, where to infect somehow etymologically means to perform into something. And in previous works, I was very much going through the materiality of water, outer space, land, mining, islands, plague, histories, to think actually of how to respond to the Syrian history of violence. The predecessor of the opera, whose working title is The 10 Murders of Josephine, that's a new thing, but it's just a working title, so perhaps it's going to change, definitely. The predecessor for that is a work, a sound play that I made in 2014, which is called Can You Pull in an actor? Can you pull in an actor with a fish hook or tie down his tongue with a rope? Which was followed by another sound play titled Can You Make a Pet of Him Like a Bird, or Put Him on a Leash for Your Girls? Both actually coming from the book of Job in the Tanakh. And this sound play started with this claim regarding justice in theater, but very much wanted to look back into a literal, theatrical phenomenon, let's say, or ceremony, and wanted to get back into the context of Lebanon, Syria, which throughout Alien Encounters I've been like avoiding like the plague in the beginning, but then, you know. And I'll stand because I will be like more understanding now if I'm saying what I'm standing. With this work, I started to look at the Ashura ritual, which is very much a religious / political ceremony that is celebrated by Shiite Muslims. And that re-witnesses the unjust slaying of Imam al-Hussein, who was not only the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, but also or so I claim, for the Shia, some sort of linguistic substitution to the ultimate figure of the oppressed. So with the re-witnessing of this slaying of al-Hussein, on one hand, the claims that I make upon Shiite thought, which also are not necessarily, you know, Shiite truths, but I think through the event of the murder of Hussein as a paradoxical event, where Hussein is on one hand has to be oppressed, has to be killed in order for the oppressed to enter the order of language and the order of representation. But the fact that Hussein was murdered also meant the erasure of Hussein from the order of representation. So Shiite thought somehow being based on the relations of justice and justice, representation, and the inaccessibility to the legal. During the ceremony, all our neighbors go down to the street. Pop-up theaters just happen to sprout in the street for 10 days because the battle through which Hussein was killed was a 10-day battle. The audience plays the role of an audience while there is an orator that plays the role of an actor. It's a very Brechtian moment where there's an orator that somehow would be telling the story in the most graphic details. You know, when the baby was shot in the head and starts crying, and at some point during the crying, he pops up an anecdote about his 3-year-old son, and then weaves that into the story again. And it's a religious thing. What is the word? It's a religious thing to do is to weep. So basically, to weep, to cry. So basically, if you are told that if you cannot cry, you have to act that you are crying. So you would see like people who wouldn't be really crying, but just evoking this physical, this actually acting technique that allows you to mourn. So it is through this access to the battle, through the narration, through the oration, through the change of accent, because the orator changes his accent to an Iraqi accent, through the chest beating, the rhythmic chest beating that allows people to go in a trance towards the battle, and lastly, through self-flagellation. So people, as men actually, and this is another thing that unfolded in a different work, the gendering of the justice system. But I'll stay in this work now. So men start cutting their foreheads, and blood is all over the place. And what happens is actually the moment that this witnessing goes back and forth between the theatrical form of witnessing and the actual form of witnessing is particularly the moment that this assembly of people constitutes itself as, or themselves as testimonial subjects, but outside the court of law. And all that, which in that work was very much, it has a totally different history also due to the fact that Hezbollah, who are a Shiite political party in Lebanon, that is bases is its ideology on this, let's say, not only the Shiite ontology, let's say, based on oppression, but on the fact that Shiites have been oppressed historically. But now this political party has somehow instituted the resistance. When they were given it was like a monopoly of the resistance against Israeli occupation in the south of Lebanon, which now, they turned resistance into an institution that somehow perpetuates the power of the state. And today, very much in power in Lebanon, they are also fighting alongside the Syrian regime, killing thousands of people, but basing and legitimating that upon the poetics, the aesthetics, and the substance of the Shiite ritual of Ashura. So that work asked, what does it mean? How is it that such militant form of theater, well, I say militant because for me, the question of how to constitute oneself as a testimonial subject outside the law is an important question, and this question migrates to the opera that I'm working on. Such a question, how could such a militant form of theater turn into a militarized form of theater? The opera takes the question of how to constitute oneself, or what does it mean to constitute oneself as a testimonial subject outside the court of law, but also what does it mean to constitute, or what does it entail to think of testimonial subjectivity as substitutive or in place of legal subjectivity, so ditching the legal altogether, throwing it in the garbage. I am working on the opera, thinking of the testimonial very much in terms of labor. So the question is somehow shifting. I'm taking very quickly, three characters of departure, which are Josephine, Kafka's Josephine, who is a very insignificant, whose voice, she's a singer mouse, and it's that the mouse folk would always convene around her to listen to her terribly insignificant voice. But very much looking, and he mentions very much the overworked townsfolk that convene around her. And he says, well, it's not, Kafka says, it's not the fact that her singing is a performance of the song, but rather it is the performance of an assembly. And I'm looking at this moment of assembly in itself as a form of labor. And so it's not assembly itself that I'm interested in, but in assembly as labor. And the second character of departure is actually Shaker Amr, who is an ex-Guantanamo Bay detainee, who was captured by bounty hunters in Afghanistan just 2 months after after the 9/11 events, and was sold and resold and resold and resold and resold and resold to different organizations, military, extra-military intelligences, which actually stood at not necessarily the same side of the fight against themselves, and how in the end he ended up being sold to the Americans and spent 14 years in Guantanamo being tortured. But after 7 years of his existence in Guantanamo, he was actually cleared to leave. But then they left him for 7 years more. And what I'm looking at is very much his body that traveled, and his body as a DNA of this economic intelligence and political shady deals and negotiations that have been happening. So I'm looking at his body somehow as a print of 21st century politics. I'm not going. The third character, very quickly, is the legal document that is relating to a claim, an insurance claim that was made by the captain of the ship Zong after he ordered the murder of 150 slaves, African slaves. I think if I can just say something very quickly about this, but I'll just say this, and because I think this is important. But I'm looking very much at there were 150 African slaves that the captain ordered to throw into the water and drown. Due to the fact that he lost his ship, or he did some errors in the sea, and some of his, the things that were on the ship were corrupted, and in order to make an insurance claim, he threw 150 lives into the sea. And it is this document, legal document, which is between him, not the owner of the ship, and the insurance company, or the insurers, where the event of the murder is in the passing. But so it's the only legal document that shows that tells something about that murder, that very untenable murder. And that questions whether these lives were actually commodities or lives, and according to which the claim was settled. And I'm very much looking at the voices, or let's say the phonic substance actually of those lost lives within the voice of the document. I'll just, if there's time to just put some sound, and otherwise I thanked you in advance for bearing, so I did my job. So, shall I?
First movement. The sleigh as the grammar of murder. Oration. Hafiz al-Hasan, al-Asad, al-Asad, Baz al-Asad, Hafiz al-Asad, Hafiz al-Asad, Hafiz al-Asad.
So now we have everybody here, and I have some questions, but please raise your hand if you do, and I'll stop. So Eric, since you were starting off, I was hoping maybe if you could share how the landscape theory within your own work, like Anabasis particularly, and this upcoming work, what are the kind of strategies that you feel differ, also in terms of navigating through the landscape itself? It's also a way of getting you to talk a little bit about the spaces that you've traversed, however you're willing to do at this stage.
In the first film that I did about Masawadachi, the landscape theory became the method for making images, given that the last bit of the title is 27 Years Without Images, because the film that Masawadachi made, shot while he was living in Lebanon, disappeared in the war. It was destroyed in a bombing, in two bombings. And the images of the other character of the film were also destroyed. So the premise of the film is that there are no images. And so the question is, how do you make images to substitute those images? And so I used the landscape theory in a sort of tongue-in-cheek manner, to create a parallel between Masawadachi and the subject of aka serial killer, who was a murderer who Masawadachi had chosen to represent through this device. And so I begin the film sort of citing this theory, but very quickly in the film turns it upside down and it ends up sort of mistreating the landscape theory in many different ways. Then it's just something that I use in a very loose way in other films. Even a film called Letters to Max. I've always been interested. I'm sort of I didn't go to. I'm self-taught as an artist. I didn't go to school for it. And one of the way in which I arrived at making forms was as a photographer initially. So I think I was an architecture photographer and I was a landscape photographer for a while. And so I sort of have an attachment to looking, thinking about what happens when you point a camera at a landscape. But I've always been aware that this theory is very problematic and for many different reasons. And the most obvious one is that it's extremely deterministic. There's looking at the sites of somebody's life does not in any way explain why somebody would, resort to an act of violence, for example. The second thing is that the premise of the theory is that you could decipher structures of power within a landscape, and I think that's possibly true, depending on how you shoot that landscape. And depending on how the structures of power materialize within an urban landscape or a scenery. But I think there's so much more that complicates things. The way in which a camera moves, the way in which the lens on the camera is going to distort in different ways the landscape, and all of so you could sort of write a dissertation about how and why the landscape theory operates in positive or negative ways, but I've sort of resorted to simply testing it and critiquing it while using it beforehand. This is an honest attempt to take it at face value initially. I think when my feeling was there are no real landscape theory films. It's been cited by various filmmakers. You could name Chantal Ackerman as one of them. You could name certainly some structuralist filmmakers. You could name some German filmmakers. But it's always sort of present as a possibility, as a filmic possibility, but it's never been fully, earnestly tried. And I thought maybe it'd be time, 38 years later, that somebody could give it an honest shot. And obviously it's, it will not be, the moment I decided to intersect it with the documents from the judicial file, obviously it changes because it becomes a diptych. It becomes about the relationship between the judicial landscape, so to speak, and how I choose to shoot that, and the landscape that I filmed around that deep site. But we did, the crew of the film did decide to go as much as possible in all of these places. So we filmed in the lower school that he went to, we filmed in the middle school that he went to, we filmed in the high school that he went to, we filmed in the university that he went to, we filmed in buildings that he lived in, we filmed in the prison where he's currently detained, we filmed in the courthouse where he was judged last year. The only place that we did not film in is on the other side of the border, because it's not possible to film in Syria, and also because Syria ends up becoming a form of hors-champ. It becomes the blind spot of the film because we don't know what happened in Syria. And in fact, the story of David is not so much, for me, what he did or didn't do in Syria. It's why he went there and what happened when he came back. Like what happened in Syria, in a way, is unseeable. So that's sort of how I approached it here. But in a way, it's taking a real chance because it's saying that I will try to. I think I started out with the willingness of taking the chance that it could fail. That was interesting for me. If it failed, but if the failure was earnest, then that would produce something that I thought might be interesting. Because if we don't understand anything through the landscape theory while applying it in this very earnest manner, then I think that for me that would at least say something about what this. I think the film would function differently, but this failure could conceivably make it a film that I would
just a short comment was that when I saw the first kind of clip or excerpt that you when we were in Mexico, the stillness of the judicial landscape, the steady space of that versus the bodily, the doubting sometimes, the more piercing look of the camera was, and that unstable space was something that really struck me. Again, I think it is a way that your practice grows in the structure of film itself, in investigating the very core structures of film is what has been interesting for me personally as well. Lawrence, surprise that you came. I thought it was great actually that you decided to show us the way that the complexity of the gunshot and voice interaction played out within that example. And of course, you did mention the earshot project, but I had to relate that experience of what it meant to look into the visual representation of the acoustic analysis that took place in earshot, and how that I also see as a progressive mode that you've taken on in this private ear role, of what it means to visualize and spatialize those sort of analysis while also presenting them to court. And the trial or the tribunal script is something that we've posted on the Contour website, so maybe it would be nice to highlight that.
Yeah, I think I realized that also I rushed a little bit. So maybe it's good to just explain a couple of things. But right, in response to what you're saying, indeed that, I mean, this case, the story of Michael Brown and the racist murder that was committed against him was in very many ways similar to the case I was working on at the time, which had to do with the death of two Palestinian boys. It's a very different story, but it revolves around, again, the specific sound of the gunshot. And there I made a film called Rubber Coated Steel. It was 1 year after the Human Rights Report came out. So the kind of advocacy had totally settled around this story. And I made a work not about exactly that case, but having almost kind of lived through it. Having dealt with both kind of the world of advocacy and human rights, and also the families and all these other kind of things. So in the end, my response to that case, even though I participated as somebody who produced kind of analysis on the sound of those gunshots, was to actually write a fictional script for a trial that is yet to happen, because there has yet been a trial for those children, unlike Michael Brown. But of course, with Michael Brown, you see that that it doesn't matter that the trial happens, because of course, what is heard in that trial is not what is at stake, right? So he's murdered, but in the end, it comes down to this kind of echo that actually kind of proves the innocence of a police officer who, in fact, murdered somebody. So what I was kind of battling with at the time was also the kind of limits of that legal language, and that's what you would read in Rubber Coated Steel. That, and also try and respond to the kind of silence. So in the case of the Palestinian children, the reason why why the gunshots became so important is because the bodies were withdrawn from autopsy, or one of them was. And that was treated by the NGOs as a kind of religiously regressive move. But this was the biggest kind of conflict ground that I was saying, no, that's political, that's politics to withdraw the body, because they don't want to be part of the same legal scrutiny. So the sound somehow became a way to stay with the shooter rather than to enter the body. But it also, the film, which has no sound of gunshots, no vision of the dead bodies, of them dying. None of that kind of violence is captured in the same way as it's circulated in the human rights thing. So it really tried to keep on a kind of level playing field, both the kind of narrative and the injustice that was done, but also the performance of silence that the family had done. So to try and keep at the forefront the kind of withdrawal of evidence, which is of course always just, it's a kind of impossible thing to enter a trial, withdrawal. And I think that's why I want to tell that case, and why I want to tell this story here, and this kind of conglomeration of things I showed, is because it helps me define a politics of listening which is extreme, which is not a politics which wants all voices to be heard and an equal platform of voices to be heard. It wants to intervene into the conditions of hearing, into the conditions of which we are heard, because I think that we can have all the free speech we want, but if the types of hearing that happens are the same which happened to Michael Brown, it doesn't really get us anywhere, right? So in one hand, there's a kind of intensity of listening, but on the other hand, there's no kind of listening back. There's no kind of turning those things. And I think why I wanted to show the hummingbird clock in that regard is because I think an intervention into listening is also, and the conditions of a listening and legal listening, is to kind of amplify the idea that we have to also kind of change and expand what constitutes speech itself, actually. So the buzz as a song, you know, and the silence as a kind of, also a kind of speech. These are all things that I'm kind of dealing with.
Are there any immediate questions? Or yeah, okay, we can.
Yeah, my name came up enough. Is it on? Yeah, is it on? No. It's on. It's on. Yeah, my name came up enough that I have a question, I guess. So, thanks for really rich presentations, and something comes into focus. Something comes into focus listening across the three artist practices that I sort of hadn't anticipated on reading the text, was the way in which it seems as though all practices are deeply informed by the concerns of kind of trying to cope with perhaps a troubled status of the image within the era of the war on terror itself, which makes me think very much, Natasha, of someone who is, again, an influence or a person that we share dialogue with, Rosalind Morris, in particular, an unpublished book that's forthcoming called Wars I Have Not Seen. And she refuses to publish it until the US wars in the Middle East cease and all troops withdrawn. But the book is attempting to deal with, from her argument, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and flowing from there as wars that have been unique in failing by and large to produce images, but have only produced an enormous amount of pictures, which she argues very few images in fact, and maybe like Abu Ghraib would be the big exception and maybe like the biggest failure thereby of that form of warfare. So that was just a reflection that sort of arose very powerfully for me from this series of presentations, and I was wondering if maybe it's figured within the conversations that have taken place among the artists and the curatorial team.
Thanks for bringing up that reference by Rosalind, which is available as a talk, but as you say, not as a published book. I do need to say that the group that we have assembled here, Three Wonders, was also, in a sense, practices that I wanted to share here and also in conversation with Daphne and Natasha, actually. So I wouldn't say that we have a sort of focus. In fact, I think that might be problematic on this very topical idea of this concentrated effort of what it might mean to investigate in at least a linear way what is unfolding, the kind of languages of terror that are unfolding. But definitely as trajectories within these practices, I think I remain very conscious of them in terms of how this language is expressed within Eric's current work, but also importantly, just sticking with you, Eric, for now for a second, which is like in Letters to Max, for instance. There is in fact an urgency to understand the role of the nation state and the problematics of the sovereign condition of the nation through that work as well, with Max as this figure who may enter the landscape of having the role to represent a certain territoriality, but then very quickly loses it. And I just feel, and again, I think with Rana's work, and my question to Rana, maybe coming to that as well, was to in fact look at the continuities in the way that Alien Encounters has been now a long project. It's been not a phase and just of your practice, but basically a constant recomposition of what it means to assemble characters, what it means to look at, like you were saying, questions of quarantine, of the plague, of certain militaristic languages, and I find that the plurality of that practice and its endurance is what is most rich, and not a thin slice of a current investigation. So maybe Rana, if you want to say something.
Does this work? The shifts that Alien Encounters that happened during Alien Encounters there are many shifts. When in the very beginning, one of the works where I conducted conversations in 2011 with 4 guys that came from Mauritania, and I conducted this conversation on board of an inflatable boat. The main question at that time was how to constitute oneself as a legal subject, but outside the ground, outside what at that time, when I was still working with provincializing planet Earth, that was the main question. The question shifted today, not how to constitute oneself as a legal subject, but how to constitute oneself as a testimonial subject and ditch legality altogether. But what is a testimonial subject? For the lack, actually, I use the word subject here for the lack of a different term, but I prefer, or I'd like to say, and tomorrow we are going to be reading together in the study group the Fred Moulton's introduction to In the Break, where he uses the word black performance. And I'd like to say, I hope he doesn't have a high-pitched something in his ear right now, like that I'm making claims about that from his, what he's saying. But I'd like to think of saying black performance just because there's a refusal of speaking of black subject or of black object. Somehow now the opera is going, the entire project of the opera is provincializing the notion of citizenship. That is, whose ontology is basically not only legal, it is a spatial kind of ontology that is what constitutes the political, let's say, and politics is the idea, is the spatiality of the polis and the cora. So the central city that is fortified on land. And I'm wondering, well, could that, what I'm calling the testimonial, which is different from testimony as a rational utterance in relation to, that is necessarily tied to the workings of the tribunal, but the testimonial as, I don't know yet, it's a project of the next 2 years. Could that be a possible ontology for a new form of political, I want to say subjectivity, but I don't want to say subjectivity. So it's a kind of it's a huge project because it might shift and all what I'm saying now is crap. And this is what we're going to be doing in the next 2 years with all the people that are going to be working. But in a way, when we speak about the image, the political is constituted through the because it's constituted through this spatiality of the polis. And I wonder whether, well, whatever I'm calling the testimonial could be a kind of substitutive of the legal-centric understanding of the worldly.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm not going to go on too long because we've been on a roll for a while, and we are all kind of slowly unwinding, ready for dinner, drinks. So maybe something to Lawrence. When Rana talked about the testimonial subject, I was also maybe wanting to hear from you how this you didn't totally answer when you talked about earshot and rubber bullets by Robert Steel, but the way that you map the voice in that particular work and the way that how do you consider this role of, in a sense, sculpting the voice? It's something that you've always tried to do, and I remember you correcting me when initially I was listening to the oral contract, the archive, and they said, this is an audio documentary. I make like, this is for you to listen. Why don't, there was this constant stressing of, and then there's stressing of how the voice and its analytics can be configured in space. And if you can talk about how then they can be re-subjected as evidence.
So, well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but yeah. To ask me, how the space of the...
What is happening? If we just go to earshot, the picture of...
But we didn't see earshots.
We didn't.
We didn't.
But you have the image on your... Okay. But what's happening there is that the sound of the gunshots has gone through an analysis in which, in the precise way in which you're talking about the killing, right?
Yes.
Where it wasn't possible. In the end, this wasn't admissible evidence. But in your case, the case that you've looked at, which is the killing of 2 Palestinian teenagers by the Israeli force, which is, again, it's putting into it's illegal because of also what has been signed, and so there is, in a sense, through your analysis, a difference that is being made.
Right.
In how you listen to that.
Yeah, I mean, there is, because on the one hand it was, on the one hand there is a legal argument, right? Which is actually a really stupid argument, which is that were they firing rubber bullets or were they firing live ammunition? That's a stupid argument because rubber bullets can still kill somebody, right? And as far as I'm concerned, although legally it's a gray area, they constitute a kind of illegitimate form of violence. So the point that I make in Rubber Coated Steel, in the trial that I fictionalized, in the hearing that never was, is that, and actually this is the point that I think is the strongest point of the whole analysis. But to understand that, you have to understand something very important about the case, which is that the gunshots that killed the 2 teenagers were not live ammunition or rubber bullets. They were a kind of weird combination of the 2, because they were using rubber bullets on the end of the rifle and firing through the rubber bullet adapter, which made the kind of gunshot suppressed and sound like a rubber bullet, right? So actually, in the end, my argument, which is not an argument, this is not a legal argument because it could not appear in the human rights report, is that this is the biggest argument against rubber bullets, because the legitimate forms of violence allow for the illegitimate forms to exist, right? That they actually cloak and actually help forms of murder which are otherwise calculated and allow one to disguise an act of murder. So the rubber bullet acts as an alibi for the perpetrator of the violence. And because it also happens in a kind of hail of rubber bullets. So there's always, I think, in my work, these moments where there's a kind of reducible kind of legal testimony, but knowing always the limits of that and always trying to find ways, like I don't mind to compromise myself politically in that sense, because I think in the end you can have come to another place. So, so yeah, I mean, it comes back to a little bit like why I was talking about lying, actually, because I think that's an interesting question for the artist, because we have to finish now. So anyway, Donald Trump and bye.
Thank you, everyone. So Contour opens on the 10th of March. Please come. Thank you to the wonderful tech team at Witte de With. Thank you.